welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most devastating conflicts in human history, World War I, often called the Great War or the War to End All. Wars. This conflict reshaped the entire world and set the stage for the century that followed. Between 1914 and 1918, over 70 million military personnel were mobilized. By the time the guns finally fell silent, more than 17 million people had lost their lives, and another 20 million were wounded. Empires that had stood for centuries crumbled. Maps were redrawn, and the world would never be the same. But how did this catastrophe begin? What turned a regional dispute in the Balkans into a global conflict? And what were the consequences that still echo through our world today? Stay with me as we explore the causes, the major battles, the technological innovations, and the lasting legacy of World War I. To understand World War I, we need to understand the world of the early 20th century. Europe in 1914 was a powder keg. 5 great powers dominated the continent: Britain, France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia. Each had their own ambitions, their own fears, and their own alliances. Germany, unified only in 1871, was flexing its industrial and military muscle. Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted Germany to have its place in the sun, colonial territories and global influence to match Britain and France. France, still burned with resentment over its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine to Germany. They wanted revenge and the return of their territories. Britain, with the world's largest navy and vast colonial empire, watched Germany's rising power with growing concern. The two nations were locked in a naval arms race, each trying to build more and bigger battleships than the other. Austro-Hungary was a multi-ethnic empire struggling to hold itself together. Nationalism was tearing at its seams, particularly from Slavic populations who wanted independence. Russia saw itself as the protector of Slavic peoples and had its own ambitions in the Balkans and control of the strategic waterways leading from the Black Sea. 2 major alliance systems had formed. The Triple Alliance linked Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Opposing them was the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Britain. These alliances meant that a conflict between any 2 powers could quickly draw in all the others. The stage was set. All that was needed was a spark. That spark came on June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was visiting the Bosnian capital with his wife Sophie. Bosnia had been annexed by Austria-Hungary in 1908, angering Serbian nationalists who wanted the region to be part of a greater Serbia. A group of young assassins, members of a secret society called the Black Hand, had positioned themselves along the Archduke's route. The first attempt failed. A bomb thrown at the motorcade missed its target. But later that day, through a twist of fate, the Archduke's car took a wrong turn and stalled directly in front of one of the conspirators, 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip. He drew his pistol and fired twice. Both Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were killed. Austria-Hungary saw this as the perfect opportunity to crush Serbian nationalism once and for all. But they needed to be sure Germany would support them if Russia came to Serbia's defense. On July 5th, Germany issued what became known as the blank check, a promise of unconditional support. Emboldened, Austria-Hungary delivered an ultimatum to Serbia on July 23rd, with demands so harsh they were designed to be rejected. Serbia's response was conciliatory but not complete acceptance. It wasn't enough. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The dominoes began to fall. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia, then on France. Germany's war plan required invading neutral Belgium to reach France, which brought Britain into the war. Within weeks, all of Europe was ablaze. Germany's strategy was based on the Schlieffen Plan: knock France out of the war quickly, then turn east to deal with Russia. Speed was everything. German forces swept through Belgium and into France, coming within 30 miles of Paris by early September 1914. But the French and British counterattacked at the Battle of the Marne, stopping the German advance. Both sides then raced north toward the English Channel, trying to outflank each other. When they reached the coast, there was nowhere left to go. The armies dug in, and the Western Front was born, a line of trenches stretching 400 miles from the Swiss border to the North Sea. This is where the war became a stalemate of unimaginable horror. Life in the trenches was a nightmare. Soldiers lived in muddy ditches, often standing in water that came up to their knees. Rats fed on corpses and rations. Lice-infested clothing. Trench foot caused by constant exposure to cold and wet conditions could rot a soldier's feet so badly they had to be amputated. The area between opposing trenches was called no man's land, a hellscape of barbed wire, shell craters, and the bodies of the fallen. When officers ordered an attack, soldiers climbed out of their trenches and advanced toward enemy lines. They were cut down by machine gun fire, which could fire 600 rounds per minute. Artillery shells rained down constantly. New weapons like poison gas created agonizing deaths. Battles on the Western Front were measured not in miles gained, but in yards, and those yards cost thousands of lives. The Battle of Verdun in 1916 lasted 10 months. France and Germany threw everything they had at each other in a meat grinder that claimed over 700,000 casualties. The front line barely moved. The Battle of the Somme, also in 1916, saw British and French forces attack German positions. On the first day alone, July 1st, 1916, the British suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, including almost 20,000 dead. It remains the bloodiest single day in British military history. By the time the battle ended months later, over 1 million men had been killed or wounded. The Allies had advanced just 6 miles. These battles broke the spirit of a generation. Soldiers called it shell shock, what we now know as PTSD. Men who survived physically were often destroyed mentally by what they had witnessed. While the Western Front remained deadlocked, the war in the East was more fluid, but no less brutal. Russia, despite its massive army, was poorly equipped and poorly led. Early Russian offensives into East Prussia were crushed at the Battle of Tannenberg in August 1914, where Germany encircled and destroyed an entire Russian army. The Eastern Front stretched over 1,000 miles, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Fighting occurred in Poland, Ukraine, and the Carpathian Mountains. The sheer scale meant armies could maneuver more than in the West, but the costs were just as terrible. Austro-Hungary struggled against both Russia and Serbia. By 1915, they needed constant German support to avoid collapse. The biggest crisis came in 1917. Years of war had devastated Russia's economy. Millions had died, food was scarce. The Russian people had had enough. In March 1917, revolution broke out. The Tsar was overthrown. A provisional government tried to continue the war, but the Russian army was disintegrating. Soldiers were deserting in massive numbers. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in a second revolution. They immediately sought peace with Germany. In March 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, surrendering vast territories to end their involvement in the war. Russia's exit allowed Germany to transfer hundreds of thousands of troops to the Western Front for one final attempt at victory. The race was on. Could Germany win before American forces arrived in full strength? World War I wasn't confined to Europe. It truly was a world war. Fighting spread to the Middle East, where the Ottoman Empire entered the war on Germany's side in November 1914. Britain and France campaigned in Mesopotamia and Palestine. The British encouraged Arab revolt against Ottoman rule, promising independence that they wouldn't fully deliver. In Africa, colonial powers fought for control of German colonies. Troops from across the British and French empires, from India, Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean, served in Europe and beyond. At sea, Britain's Royal Navy established a blockade of Germany, strangling its economy. Germany responded with unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking merchant ships headed to Britain. This policy would prove fateful. Italy, despite being part of the Triple Alliance, had remained neutral. But in 1915, swayed by Allied promises of territorial gains, Italy entered the war against Austria-Hungary and Germany. Fighting in the Alps became some of the war's most difficult, with battles fought in mountain passes and terrible conditions. The war even reached East Asia, where Japan entered on the Allied side, seizing German colonies in China and the Pacific. Millions of people who had never heard of Sarajevo or the Balkans were now caught up in this devastating conflict. The United States tried to remain neutral. President Woodrow Wilson won re-election in 1916, partly on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare made neutrality increasingly difficult. American ships were being sunk. American lives were being lost. The breaking point came in 1917. British intelligence intercepted a telegram from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico, proposing a military alliance against the United States. If war broke out, Germany would help Mexico recover territories lost in the Mexican-American War, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. When this telegram was published in American newspapers, public opinion shifted dramatically. Combined with continued submarine attacks, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. On April 6, 1917, America entered World War I. The American Expeditionary Force, commanded by General John Pershing, began arriving in France. These fresh troops, with their equipment and enthusiasm, provided a crucial boost to the exhausted Allied armies, but it would take time to train and deploy American forces in meaningful numbers. The question remained: could the Allies hold on until help arrived? World War I saw the debut of weapons that changed warfare forever. Machine guns made frontal assaults suicidal. A single gun crew could mow down waves of attacking infantry. Artillery became more powerful and more accurate. Heavy guns could hurl shells weighing hundreds of pounds over many miles. The Western Front was constantly under bombardment. The sound of artillery was so constant that silence felt unnatural. Poison gas was first used by Germany at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915. Chlorine gas rolled across no man's land in a yellow-green cloud, choking and blinding Allied soldiers. Soon, both sides were using gas: chlorine, phosgene, and the especially dreaded mustard gas, which burned skin and lungs. Gas masks became standard equipment, giving soldiers an eerie, insect-like appearance. Aircraft, barely a decade old in 1914, evolved rapidly during the war. Observation planes spotted enemy positions. Fighter planes battled for control of the skies. Bombers carried the war to cities far from the front lines. Names like the Red Baron became legendary. Tanks appeared in 1916, lumbering mechanical monsters designed to cross trenches and break through barbed wire while protecting their crews from machine gun fire. Early tanks were slow and unreliable, but they pointed the way toward future warfare. Submarines, or U-boats as Germany called them, revolutionized naval warfare. These underwater hunters could sink ships without warning, making traditional surface blockades obsolete. The Industrial Revolution had given humanity unprecedented productive power. World War I showed the horrifying results when that power was turned toward destruction. By 1918, all sides were exhausted. But Germany, freed from fighting Russia, launched one last massive offensive in the spring. The Spring Offensive, beginning in March 1918, saw German forces break through Allied lines and advance rapidly. Once again, they threatened Paris. It seemed Germany might snatch victory after all, but the offensive ran out of steam. Germany had gambled everything and come up short. Their army was spent. Meanwhile, American troops were arriving in France at a rate of 10,000 per day. In August 1918, the Allies counterattacked. The 100 Days Offensive pushed German forces back steadily. New tactics combined infantry, tanks, artillery, and aircraft in coordinated assaults. Germany's allies began to collapse. Bulgaria surrendered in September. The Ottoman Empire followed in October. Austro-Hungary disintegrated into revolution and signed an armistice on November 3rd. Germany was now alone and surrounded. The British naval blockade had brought Germany to the brink of starvation. Revolution was breaking out across Germany. The Kaiser's government was finished. On November 9th, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. 2 days later, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the armistice took effect. The guns fell silent. After 4 years, 3 months, and 1 week, the Great War was over. Soldiers on both sides emerged from their trenches. Some celebrated, others were simply numb. Many couldn't believe they had survived. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Over 17 million dead, both military and civilian. Another 20 million wounded. Many of those wounds were catastrophic. Missing limbs, disfigured faces, damaged lungs from gas exposure, minds broken by shell shock. Entire villages in France lost every young man of military age. The lost generation had been decimated. France suffered over 1.3 million military deaths. Germany, over 2 million. Russia's casualties were the highest, perhaps 3 million dead, though exact numbers are uncertain given the chaos of revolution and civil war. Britain lost nearly 900,000, with hundreds of thousands more from across its empire. Austro-Hungary, over 1 million. Italy, over 600,000. The Ottoman Empire, between 700,000 and 900,000. The United States, despite entering late in the war, lost over 116,000, more than half from the Spanish flu pandemic that swept through military camps. The economic cost was equally staggering. The war had cost hundreds of billions of dollars. Entire regions were devastated. Farms were destroyed. Cities were damaged or ruined. The infrastructure of civilization had been torn apart. And then there were the costs that couldn't be measured in numbers. Families destroyed, lives that would never be lived, art that would never be created, innovations that would never be conceived. In January 1919, representatives from the victorious powers gathered in Paris to negotiate peace. The most important leaders were the Big Four: Woodrow Wilson of the United States, David Lloyd George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Each had different goals. Wilson wanted a fair peace based on his 14 points, including the creation of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. Lloyd George wanted to punish Germany, but not so harshly that it would create future problems. Clemenceau wanted revenge, to cripple Germany so completely it could never threaten France again. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, reflected Clemenceau's desire for punishment. Germany was forced to accept complete responsibility for causing the war. The infamous war guilt clause, Germany, had to pay enormous reparations, eventually set at 132 billion gold marks, an impossible sum. Germany lost all its colonies and 13% of its European territory, including Alsace-Lorraine, back to France. The German military was reduced to a tiny force. The industrial Rhineland was to be occupied by Allied forces. Germans were humiliated. They called it a diktat, a dictated peace, not a negotiated one. Many Germans, including a young war veteran named Adolf Hitler, vowed that Germany would rise again. The treaty also redrew the map of Europe. Austria-Hungary was broken up into separate nations. Poland was recreated after over a century of partition. New nations like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were born. The Ottoman Empire was carved up, with Britain and France taking control of the Middle East. World War I changed everything. 4 empires fell: the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires all collapsed, replaced by new nations and new systems of government. The war accelerated social change. Women had taken on roles in factories and offices while men fought, and many countries granted women suffrage after the war. Class distinctions that seemed eternal before the war were challenged. The war advanced technology dramatically, from aviation to medicine to communications. The techniques of mass production developed for the war would later be applied to peacetime industries. But perhaps the most important legacy was what the war did to people's minds. The optimism and faith in progress that characterized the pre-war era was shattered. Writers, artists, and intellectuals expressed disillusionment and despair. The world had witnessed what modern technology could do when applied to destruction, and it was terrifying. The Treaty of Versailles failed to create a lasting peace. Instead, it sowed the seeds of another, even more devastating conflict. The harsh terms imposed on Germany created resentment that Adolf Hitler would exploit. The redrawing of borders created ethnic tensions that persist today. The League of Nations, established to prevent future wars, proved ineffective without the participation of the United States, which rejected the treaty. Just 21 years after the end of World War I, the world would be at war again. World War II was, in many ways, the unfinished business of the first conflict. World War I's legacy continues today. The borders drawn after the war still shape conflicts in the Middle East. The collapse of empires unleashed forces of nationalism that continue to drive global events. The lessons about the dangers of nationalism, militarism, and entangling alliances remain relevant. Perhaps most importantly, World War I reminds us of the catastrophic consequences when diplomacy fails and nations choose war. Those haunting images of the trenches, the fields of crosses marking graves, the destroyed landscapes, they stand as warnings to future generations. The Great War truly was the war that changed the world. Understanding it helps us understand the century that followed and the world we live in today. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please like and subscribe. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on World War I. What aspect of the war do you find most interesting or important? I'll see you in the next video.